The second run was a study in controlled, screaming terror. Eleanor's mind partitioned itself, one part a cold, calculating machine tracking the rhythm of the explosions, the other a raw nerve end screaming for survival. They moved like phantoms in the strobing light, their world reduced to the few feet of churned earth in front of them and the deafening percussion of the bombs. They reached the triage tent, the gash in its side now a gaping maw spewing smoke and the desperate cries of the men trapped within. The scene inside was worse than before. A direct hit had sheared off a corner of the structure, and the wounded from that section were gone, simply erased. The remaining men were in a state of pure, primal panic. "My leg! God, someone help me! My leg!" a corporal shrieked, clutching a bloody stump where his foot should have been. Another soldier, blinded by bandages, was flailing wildly, screaming for his mother. Eleanor went to the nearest critical, a sergeant with a severe abdominal wound. His face was the color of parchment, his breathing shallow. "You're going to be okay, Sergeant," she said, her voice a forced calm as she and Jimmy maneuvered him onto the stretcher. "We're getting you out of here." The man's eyes, clouded with pain and morphine, focused on her for a second. "Nurse, the boys, don't leave the boys," he whispered. The weight of his words, the trust in his dying eyes, was a heavier burden than the stretcher would ever be. They lifted him and turned for the door, just as a string of bombs walked its way across the compound, each impact closer than the last. Boom, boom, boom! The ground leapt beneath their feet. They froze in the doorway, trapped as dirt and debris rained down around them. This was it. The law of averages that Sergeant Miller had mentioned. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the final, obliterating impact. But it didn't come. The last bomb in the sequence hit 30 yards away, obliterating the latrine and sending a foul-smelling geyser into the air. The lull. It was now or never. "Go! Go!" she screamed, and they burst from the tent, running with a desperate, lurching gait. The journey back was a nightmare of slipping in mud, of muscles burning with fatigue, of the stretcher feeling like it was filled with lead. Shrapnel zipped past Eleanor's head, so close she felt the wind of its passage. A piece of hot, twisted metal embedded itself in the wooden frame of the stretcher with a sickening thwack. They didn't stop. They couldn't. They stumbled into the bunker, passing the sergeant off to waiting hands, and collapsed against the wall, gasping. They had done it again. 2 saved. But the cost was written on their faces. Jimmy was hyperventilating, and Helen was silently weeping. Eleanor looked at the faces still in the tent, their numbers seeming undiminished. The clock was ticking, and they were moving in slow motion. Sergeant Miller grabbed her arm. "Lieutenant, we can't keep this up. The men, we're not going to make it. We're going to get ourselves killed for nothing." His words were pragmatic, the voice of a soldier who knew when a position was untenable. But Eleanor was not a soldier in that sense. She was a nurse. Her duty was to life, not to tactical retreat. She looked at the bunker, now holding a handful of saved men, then back towards the tent, where dozens more awaited a fate she alone seemed determined to challenge. The bombing intensified, the concussions coming faster, harder. The very concrete of the bunker shuddered. A fine dust sifted down from the ceiling. They were running out of time. The enemy above was not just trying to destroy the hospital, it was trying to bury it, and them with it. And as a particularly violent blast shook the foundations, a long, ominous crack appeared in the bunker ceiling, a stark reminder that their sanctuary was itself becoming a trap, a potential mass grave that offered only a slightly slower death than the one outside. The first breath outside the tent was like inhaling pure fire. The air was a toxic cocktail of cordite, burning oil, and the coppery, unmistakable scent of blood. The world had been painted in shades of orange and black, a flickering, hellish canvas where shadows leaped and danced with malevolent life. The concussion of a nearby blast slammed into her, a physical blow that made her stagger. But her grip on the first stretcher, bearing a private with a chest wound who gasped like a fish out of water, never loosened. "Just hold on, soldier," she hissed, more to herself than to him, her voice a ragged thread in the roaring tapestry of destruction. The courtyard, their only path to the supposed safety of the underground bunkers, was a gauntlet of death. Geysers of earth erupted with every new impact, and shrapnel whined through the air like a swarm of metallic, angry hornets. Every instinct screamed at her to dive for cover, to curl into a ball and pray for the storm to pass. But the weight of the man on the stretcher, the feel of his clammy hand gripping her arm, anchored her to her terrible purpose. This was the crucible. This was where the abstract concept of duty was forged in the real, searing heat of sacrifice. The orderly on the other end of the stretcher, a boy named Jimmy who couldn't be more than 19, had tears streaming down his soot-streaked face. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror. "We'll never make it," he cried out, his voice cracking. Eleanor didn't answer with words. She fixed him with a look, a stare that held all the fierce, desperate resolve of a cornered animal. It was a look that said, "We have to. There is no other option." And with that silent command, they lunged forward, their feet slipping on the churned, muddy earth. They moved in a frantic, lurching dash, a macabre dance between the blossoming fireballs. The ground shook, and the sound was a physical pressure, a giant's hand trying to swat them from the earth. They passed a crater, still steaming, that had been a supply truck moments before. The twisted, blackened skeleton of the vehicle was a grim monument to their own potential fate. Halfway across the 50-yard killing zone, a blast wave hit them from the side, lifting the stretcher and throwing them to the ground. Eleanor landed hard, the wind knocked out of her, her ears ringing so loudly the world became a muted, underwater nightmare. For a second she lay there, the mud cool against her cheek. The temptation to just close her eyes and let the darkness take her was overwhelmingly seductive. But then she felt a weak tug on her sleeve. The private on the stretcher was looking at her, his eyes wide with a silent plea that cut through the fog of her concussion. He was still alive. She crawled to him, her body screaming in protest, and checked his bandages. They were still holding. "Jimmy!" she yelled, her voice a distant, muffled thing to her own ears. The orderly was getting to his knees, dazed but moving. Together they righted the stretcher, and with a strength born of pure adrenaline, lifted it once more. The last 20 yards were a blur of sheer, mindless exertion. They stumbled into the dark mouth of the bunker entrance, collapsing into the relative quiet, their chests heaving. They had saved one out of 50. Eleanor looked back at the triage tent, a lone, fragile structure being systematically dismantled by the relentless bombing. It seemed a million miles away. The task was Herculean, the cost already felt in the trembling of her limbs and the terror in Jimmy's eyes. But as she saw the faces of the other orderlies and nurses huddled in the bunker, their own fear mirrored back at her. She knew this first, near-suicidal run was just the opening gambit. They had a system now, however fragile. They had a path, however deadly. But the bombers were still circling, their engines a constant droning promise of more death. And the next trip back into that fire would be even harder, because now they knew exactly what they were walking into. A knowledge that settled in their guts like a block of ice, a chilling premonition of the horrors yet to come. The relative silence of the bunker was a hollow, deceptive thing. It was not true quiet, but rather the oppressive, drum-tight pressure of waiting, punctuated by the muffled, earth-shaking crump of bombs finding their marks above. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete, sweat, and fear. Eleanor leaned against the cold wall, her knees weak, her lungs burning. The private they had saved was being attended to by another nurse, his shallow breaths a fragile counter-rhythm to the distant thunder. Jimmy was vomiting in a corner, his body purging the adrenaline and terror. Eleanor's mind, however, was already clawing its way back from the edge of panic. She couldn't afford to feel. She had to think, to plan, to turn this desperate flight into a repeatable, if still suicidal, operation. She looked at the faces around her, a handful of orderlies, 2 other nurses, their eyes wide and shell-shocked. They were looking to her. She had led the first charge. The mantle of leadership, unasked for and terrifying, had been thrust upon her. "We can't wait for it to be over," she said, her voice raw but steady, cutting through the tense silence. "They'll be back. They always come back. We have to get everyone out now." A senior orderly, a grizzled man named Sergeant Miller with a gash on his forehead, shook his head. "It's a suicide run, Lieutenant. We got lucky once. The law of averages is going to catch up." "It's not about luck, Sergeant," Eleanor countered, her gaze sweeping over the group, making eye contact with each one, trying to transfer some of her own desperate resolve. "It's about speed and timing. We watch the pattern. The bombs aren't falling in a continuous sheet. There are lulls, a few seconds between impacts in a specific area. That's our window." She was creating strategy from chaos, finding order in the madness. "We go in teams of 4, 2 per stretcher. We run, we don't look back. We get to the tent, we grab a man, and we run for the bunker. We do it over and over until there's no one left." She pointed to a stack of folded stretchers leaning against the wall. "We use those. The men who can walk, even a little, we support them. The ambulatory patients, we form a chain. But the criticals, they come first. Her plan was simple, brutal, and terrifying. It relied on a precision that the chaos upstairs seemed to mock. But it was a plan. It was a thread of hope. She saw the doubt in their eyes, but she also saw the dawning spark of purpose. It was better than waiting to be buried alive. "Jimmy," she said, turning to the young orderly. He flinched at his name. "You with me?" He wiped his mouth, his face pale, but he gave a shaky nod. He was terrified, but he wasn't a coward. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath and moved to the bunker's reinforced door. She peered out through a narrow crack. The world outside was an apocalyptic vision. Fires raged, casting a flickering, demonic light. The sound was a physical wall. She watched, her body tense, timing the blasts. 1, 2, 3. A lull of maybe 5 seconds near the tent. It was enough. It had to be enough. "First team, on me," she yelled, hefting a folded stretcher. Sergeant Miller, despite his misgivings, stepped forward, along with Jimmy and another nurse, Helen. Their eyes were wide, their knuckles white. They were a pitiful army, armed with nothing but canvas and courage. Eleanor called the heavy door open, and the full, screaming fury of the bombing raid poured in. A wave of sound and pressure that threatened to shatter their resolve before they even took a step. The heat from the fires washed over them, a blistering foretaste of the hell they were voluntarily re-entering. "Now!" Eleanor screamed, and she plunged back out into the maelstrom, the first step of a relay race against death. Her small team following in her wake, their fate hinging on a stopwatch counting down seconds in the heart of an inferno. Each tick a potential eternity. Each talk a possible end. The crack in the ceiling was a silent, spreading threat, a spiderweb of doom that held more terror for Eleanor than the screaming shrapnel outside. The bunker was no longer safe. It was a collapsing liability. They had to evacuate everyone, not just from the tent, but from this supposed refuge as well. The calculus of their nightmare had just been irrevocably altered. There was a deeper, more secure storage cellar on the far side of the compound used for medical supplies. It was their only hope. But it meant crossing an even wider, more exposed stretch of open ground, a journey that seemed, in that moment, utterly impossible. Despair, cold and heavy, began to seep into her bones. They were out of options, out of time, out of miracles. Then, through the roaring in her ears, she heard it. A new sound, a deeper, angrier drone that clawed at a different frequency. She rushed back to the door and peered out. The sky was now a tangled ballet of death. Tracers, brilliant lines of red and green, stitched chaotic patterns against the blackness. The dark shapes of the German bombers were now harried by the sleeker, faster silhouettes of Allied night fighters. A Junkers Ju-88, caught in a cone of searchlights, erupted into a brilliant, silent flower of orange and yellow, its wings tearing away as it spiraled groundward in a lazy, tragic arc. The air battle was raging directly overhead. It was both a blessing and a curse. The bombing became more erratic, less focused, as the attackers tried to evade the fighters. But the sky was now raining not just bombs, but also burning aircraft, falling shell casings, and screaming out-of-control engines. The danger was now three-dimensional. "They're engaging!" Eleanor shouted back into the bunker, a wild, desperate hope flaring in her chest. "The fighters are here! It's our chance! The bombing will be distracted!" Sergeant Miller joined her at the door, his experienced eyes assessing the new, more complex battlefield. "It's a different kind of hell out there now, Lieutenant. We could just as easily be crushed by a falling plane as by a bomb." "It's our only chance, Sergeant," Eleanor insisted, her voice fierce. "The bunker is compromised. We have to move everyone to the storage cellar, now, while they're busy up there." She turned to the huddled group, her nurses and orderlies, the few walking wounded. Their faces were pale masks of fear. "This is it," she yelled, her voice cutting through the thunder. "We are not waiting to die in here. We are going to move, all of us, together. The ambulatory patients will help the criticals. We form a human chain. We move fast and we do not stop for anything. Is that understood?" There was a moment of hesitation, a collective intake of breath. Then a young private with a bandaged arm stood up. "I can help, ma'am." Another, then another. The spark she had nurtured was catching. They were terrified, but they were choosing action over despair. They began the frantic preparation, helping the criticals onto stretchers, forming pairs and teams. Eleanor assigned Jimmy and Helen to lead the first group, a cluster of walking wounded supporting 2 stretcher paces. "Wait for my signal," she instructed, her eyes glued to the sky, watching the deadly dance. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 streaked overhead, its cannons blinking, pursued by a dark shape she recognized as a P-61 Black Widow. The noise was indescribable, a symphony of screaming engines, ripping cannons, and the crump of bombs. She saw a lull in the ground explosions directly on the path to the cellar. "Now, go!" she screamed. The first group burst from the bunker, a ragged line of humanity scrambling across the open ground. They were halfway there when a burning engine, torn from its aircraft, tumbled from the sky and impacted 50 yards to their left, showering them with molten metal and burning fuel. A soldier screamed as a piece of hot debris seared his back, but he kept running, driven by a terror greater than pain. They made it, disappearing into the dark entrance of the cellar. One group safe. But Eleanor and Sergeant Miller, along with a few others, were still in the bunker with the last of the critical patients. They had to make one last desperate run back to the main tent. The fight in the air was reaching a fever pitch, and Eleanor knew with a chilling certainty that this would be the final trip. Either they would get everyone out, or they would all die in the attempt. She looked at Miller, and he gave a grim, resolute nod. They gathered the last 2 stretchers. The tent loomed ahead, a shattered monument surrounded by fire, its interior glowing with the light of a single, miraculously still burning lantern, a beacon in the storm, calling them to their final, most dangerous mission yet. The return to the tent felt like diving into the belly of a beast that was actively dying. The air was thicker now, acrid with the smell of burning canvas, and something else, something sweet and sickening, the smell of seared flesh. The single lantern swung, casting long, dancing shadows that made the remaining wounded men look like specters. There were 8 left. 8 men who, by some cruel twist of fate or the sheer chaos of the bombing, had been passed over. The most critical, the hardest to move. A lieutenant with both legs shattered. A young private with 3rd-degree burns covering his torso, his breathing a wet, ragged struggle. These were the ones no one expected to survive, even in the best of conditions. To move them was to risk killing them. To leave them was a death sentence. Eleanor's resolve, which had been a steel rod in her spine, wavered for the first time. This was the grim arithmetic of triage she had been taught, but had never truly faced. The conscious, brutal allocation of resources away from those deemed unsalvageable. But looking into the eyes of the burned private, seeing the faint, desperate light of consciousness there, she knew she could not make that calculation. They were all getting out. "Miller, you and Davis take the lieutenant," she commanded, her voice hoarse but firm. "Jimmy, you're with me. We're taking the burn victim." Jimmy stared at the private, his face a mask of horror. The man's skin was a ruin of blackened flesh and angry red blisters. How do we even carry him?" he stammered. "We use a blanket," Eleanor said, her mind working with a frightening, detached clarity. "We slide him onto it. We carry the corners, gently. His pain will be unimaginable, but it's the only way." They worked quickly, their movements efficient despite the tremors of fear and exhaustion. As they carefully log-rolled the private onto the thick wool blanket, he let out a scream that was less a sound and more a raw tearing of his soul, a sound that would haunt Eleanor for the rest of her life. She administered a small, precious dose of morphine from her kit, whispering empty platitudes she no longer believed. "It's okay, son. It's almost over. Just hold on." Outside, the air battle was reaching its crescendo. The roar of engines was a constant, deafening presence. A wingless fuselage of a German bomber cartwheeled across the sky and plowed into the forest at the edge of the compound. The resulting explosion, a final, dramatic exclamation point in the night's violence. The primary bombing, however, seemed to have ceased. The immediate, earth-shattering impacts had stopped. The storm was passing. But the danger was far from over. The fires still raged, and the structural integrity of the battered tent was failing by the second. A main support beam groaned ominously. "We have to go, now!" Sergeant Miller yelled, he and his partner already moving towards the exit with their stretcher. Eleanor and Jimmy lifted the blanket, a grisly hammock holding a broken body. The weight was uneven, the burden immense. They shuffled forward, their progress agonizingly slow. They were the last ones out. The tent, their world for so many grueling hours, seemed to sigh in relief, its task of shelter finally over. They stepped out into the apocalyptic landscape. The path to the storage cellar was littered with new craters and burning wreckage. They had only moved 20 feet when the world behind them gave way. With a final, groaning shriek of protesting wood and canvas, the main triage tent collapsed in on itself, a billowing cloud of dust and sparks rising where it once stood. If they had been seconds slower, they would have been buried. The sight fueled their final desperate sprint. They stumbled towards the dark opening of the cellar, their legs buckling, their lungs on fire. Hands reached out from the darkness, pulling them in, taking the weight of the blanket from their bleeding, trembling hands. They collapsed onto the cold, earthen floor of the cellar. The relative silence, a shocking, disorienting vacuum after hours of relentless noise. They had done it. Against all odds, against all logic, they had evacuated the entire hospital. But as Eleanor looked at the broken, bleeding, and burned forms crammed into the dark, cramped space, as she heard the ragged, pained breathing of the private they had just carried, she knew the battle was far from over. The bombing raid had ended, but the raid on her soul and the long, dark night of keeping these men alive with little more than willpower and a dwindling supply of morphine was just beginning. Silence. It was the most alien sound Eleanor had ever heard. It pressed in on her ears, a heavy, ringing absence that was somehow more unnerving than the cacophony it had replaced. In the dark, damp cellar, the only sounds were the ragged symphony of suffering, the shallow, whistling breaths of the chest wound, the low, constant moan of the burn victim, the choked sobs of a soldier in the throes of shell shock. The air was thick with the smell of blood, burnt flesh, and the coppery tang of fear. They were safe from the bombs, but they were now prisoners in a subterranean world of pain, and Eleanor was their only warden. Her body screamed for rest. Every muscle was a knot of agony, her hands raw and bleeding from gripping stretchers and tearing canvas. A deep, throbbing ache had settled behind her eyes, but closing them was not an option. The moment she did, the images flashed behind her lids. The soldier erased by the direct hit, the scream of the burned private, the collapsing tent. She was operating on a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed, a well of resolve that was fed by the sheer, desperate need of the men around her. "Report," she whispered to Nurse Helen, her voice a dry croak. Helen's face was streaked with dirt and tears. "We have 47 men, Lieutenant. 8 critical, 15 serious, the rest walking wounded or minor injuries. Our supplies, they're almost gone. The morphine is down to a few syringes. Bandages, we're tearing up shirts." It was a dire assessment. They had saved their lives from the bombs only to watch them potentially slip away from shock, blood loss, or infection in this hole. Eleanor moved through the packed bodies, a ghost in the flickering light of a single electric torch they had salvaged. She stopped by the burned private. His eyes were open, staring at the dirt ceiling. She knelt, wiping his forehead with a damp, relatively clean piece of cloth. "What's your name, soldier?" she asked softly. "Peter, ma'am," he whispered, his voice a papery rustle. "Peter Miller, from Indiana." "You're going to be all right, Peter Miller from Indiana," she said, the lie feeling like a betrayal on her tongue, but a necessary one. "The worst is over. We just have to hold on until morning." She moved to the lieutenant with the shattered legs, checking his improvised splints. He was unconscious, his pulse thready. She administered the last of the morphine to a man with a piece of shrapnel in his gut who was writhing in silent agony. Each decision was a tiny moral torture. Who deserved the last measure of peace? Who could endure the pain a little longer? Sergeant Miller approached her, his face grim in the low light. "We've tried the field telephone. The lines are dead, completely cut. We're on our own until someone finds us." The reality of their isolation settled over the cellar like a shroud. They were an island of misery in a sea of destruction. No help was coming, not tonight. It was just them. Eleanor felt the weight of it all threatening to crush her. The responsibility was a physical weight on her shoulders. She found a relatively clear corner and slid down the wall, finally allowing her body to rest, though her mind continued to race. She looked at her hands, caked in dirt and blood, the blood of dozens of men, American boys from every corner of the country, who had trusted her with their lives. She had gotten them out of the fire, but could she keep them alive until dawn? The darkness outside the cellar entrance was absolute, a solid wall of black. The fires still burned, casting a faint hellish glow, but the world had gone quiet. Too quiet. It was the silence of a battlefield holding its breath, the silence after the storm, pregnant with an unspoken question. What fresh horror would the dawn reveal? And as she sat there, listening to the labored breathing of Peter Miller, she knew that the enemy was no longer in the sky. The enemy was time, an infection, and a more insidious foe that was already seeping into their underground refuge. The hours stretched into an eternity of whispered prayers, stifled moans, and the chilling finality of a death rattle. 2 of the criticals succumbed before midnight. There was nothing Eleanor or anyone else could do. They died in the dark, surrounded by strangers, their passing marked only by a sudden cessation of sound, a hollow space in the symphony of suffering. Eleanor closed their eyes, her hands trembling, and covered their faces with scraps of blanket. Each one felt like a personal failure, a defeat in the private war she was waging against the Reaper. The morale in the cellar, which had been sustained by the adrenaline of the escape, was plummeting. Despair was a contagion more dangerous than any infection. Men who had been stoic began to weep openly. Others slipped into a catatonic state, their minds retreating from a reality too horrific to bear. Eleanor closed their eyes, her hands trembling, and covered their faces with scraps of blanket. Each one felt like a personal failure, a defeat in the private war she was waging against the Reaper. The morale in the cellar, which had been sustained by the adrenaline of the escape, was plummeting. Despair was a contagion more dangerous than any infection. Men who had been stoic began to weep openly. Others slipped into a catatonic state, their minds retreating from a reality too horrific to bear. Eleanor knew she had to fight this invisible enemy as fiercely as she had fought the bombs. She couldn't let hope die in this hole. She stood up, her legs protesting, and moved to the center of the cramped space. Her voice, when she spoke, was tired but clear, carrying through the gloom. "I need everyone who can hear my voice to listen," she began. "My name is Lieutenant Eleanor Connelly. I'm from Dayton, Ohio." She saw a few faces turn towards her in the dim light. "I know you're scared. I know you're in pain. So am I." She held up her bloody, trembling hands. "But look around you. You are not alone. You are surrounded by your brothers. We have been through hell together tonight, and we are still here." She pointed towards the cellar entrance. "The sun will rise. It always does. And when it does, help will come. They will find us. But until then, we look out for each other. If the man next to you is struggling, you talk to him. You remind him of home. You remind him of his mother, his wife, his girl back home. You share your water. You hold his hand if you have to." She walked over to Peter Miller, the burned soldier. "This is Private Peter Miller from Indiana. He's holding on. He's fighting. We're all going to fight." Her words were simple, devoid of grand oratory, but they were real. They were human. A soldier with a bandaged arm started humming a tune, softly at first, then with more conviction. It was "God Bless America." Another voice joined in, then another. Soon, the cellar was filled with the low, ragged, but determined sound of men singing, their voices a fragile shield against the darkness and the fear. It was one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking sounds Eleanor had ever heard. In that moment, she was no longer just a nurse. She was a shepherd, tending to the flickering flames of her flock's spirit. She moved among them again, her task different now. She wasn't just checking bandages. She was making eye contact, offering a smile, a nod, a word of encouragement. She helped a private write a short, shaky letter to his parents on a scrap of paper, a letter he prayed would not be his last. She listened to a sergeant from Texas talk about his ranch, the dust of which seemed a million miles away. She was building a fortress, not of stone, but of shared humanity. But as the night wore on, the cold began to seep into the cellar. The men, already in shock, started to shiver uncontrollably. Hypothermia was setting in, a new silent killer. They huddled together for warmth, the wounded and the whole, officers and enlisted men, all distinctions erased by their shared plight. Eleanor gave her own jacket to a shivering private. She was cold to the bone, but the act of giving provided a different kind of warmth. She sat back down, pulling her knees to her chest, watching over her charges. The singing had faded, replaced by the soft sounds of fitful sleep and murmured conversations. They had found a new strength, a collective will to endure. But as the first faint hint of gray began to tinge the darkness at the cellar entrance, a new sound reached them, a sound that froze the blood in their veins. It was the low rumble of engines and the distinct clattering sound of tank treads. The hope that had begun to bloom in their hearts was instantly strangled by a new, terrifying question. Whose engines? Whose tanks? Had they survived the bombing raid only to be discovered by an enemy patrol, to be taken prisoner, or worse, in this vulnerable underground trap? The sound grew louder, closer, a mechanical heartbeat of impending doom. The rumble was not the deep-throated growl of the German panzers they had learned to fear, but a different, slightly higher-pitched clatter. It was the sound of Sherman tanks, American tanks. A wave of relief so powerful it was physically dizzying washed over the cellar. Men began to weep again, but this time with joy, with the sheer, unadulterated release of salvation. Shouts of, "They're here! They found us!" echoed in the confined space. Eleanor felt her own eyes well up, the rigid control she had maintained for hours finally cracking. She stumbled to her feet, her body moving on autopilot, and climbed the short earthen steps to peer out of the cellar entrance. The dawn had broken, casting a weak gray light over a landscape of utter devastation. The field hospital was gone, replaced by a smoldering junkyard of twisted metal, splintered wood, and craters. And rolling through this hellscape, like avenging angels clad in olive drab, was a column of Sherman tanks, and following them, trucks filled with infantry, their faces young and grim beneath their helmets. A jeep screeched to a halt not 50 yards from the cellar. An officer, a major, jumped out, his jaw dropping as he took in the scene of destruction. Eleanor stepped out into the open, a slight, filthy figure in a torn and blood-stained nurse's uniform, her face smudged with soot and tears. She raised a hand, a feeble wave. The major saw her and rushed over, his medics fanning out behind him. "My God," the major breathed, his eyes sweeping from her to the men now cautiously emerging from the cellar like survivors of a shipwreck. Are you in charge here?" Eleanor nodded, her voice failing her for a moment. She cleared her throat, forcing the words out. "Lieutenant Eleanor Connelly, 12th Field Hospital. We have 45 men down here, sir. 8 critical. We've been here all night." The major's expression was one of pure, unvarnished astonishment. He looked at the destroyed hospital, then back at the stream of wounded, battered, but alive men being helped from the cellar. "All night? You evacuated the entire unit during that raid?" "We got everyone out, sir," Eleanor said, the statement simple, factual, and utterly monumental. The major just stared at her, a look of profound respect dawning on his face. "Medics, over here, now!" he bellowed. A flurry of activity erupted. Fresh medics with full kits poured into the cellar, gently but efficiently taking over the care of the wounded. Stretchers appeared, and the process of evacuating the men to a rear-area hospital began in earnest. Eleanor stood to the side, watching the scene, feeling strangely detached. Her job was done. The weight was lifted, and in its place was a vast, hollow emptiness. She watched as Peter Miller was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, his eyes meeting hers for a second. He gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. Sergeant Miller came to stand beside her, his own face etched with a fatigue that went bone deep. "We did it, Lieutenant," he said quietly. "I didn't think it was possible, but we did it." Eleanor just nodded, unable to speak. The adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, leaving her a trembling, empty shell. The major approached her again, his demeanor softer now. "Lieutenant, my men will handle this. You need medical attention yourself." He gestured to a waiting truck. "We'll get you back to HQ, get you cleaned up, get some food in you." Eleanor allowed herself to be led to the truck. She climbed into the back, sitting on a hard wooden bench, and watched as the last of her men were loaded into other vehicles. As the truck engine rumbled to life and began to pull away from the smoldering ruins, she looked back one last time. The dawn sun, now clearing the horizon, cast a long, golden light over the destruction, illuminating the cratered earth and the ghosts of the night just past. They had survived. But as the truck bounced along the rutted road, carrying her away from the nightmare, she knew that a part of her would always remain in that cellar, in that tent, forever tied to the sounds of screaming metal and the silent, trusting eyes of the men she had fought to save. The battle was over, but the war within her was just beginning. The headquarters was a world of organized chaos, a stark contrast to the primal struggle of the cellar. The buzz of telephones, the clatter of typewriters, the brisk efficiency of staff officers, it was all so jarringly normal, yet it felt like a foreign country to Eleanor. She had been processed, her minor wounds cleaned and bandaged, her torn uniform replaced with a fresh one. She had eaten a hot meal she couldn't taste and drunk coffee that did nothing to warm the cold spot deep inside her. She was sitting now in a quiet anteroom, waiting to be debriefed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at a wall map of Europe without really seeing it. The physical exhaustion was a leaden weight, but it was the mental and emotional toll that was truly crippling. Her mind was a newsreel stuck on a loop, replaying the horrors of the night in vivid, technicolor detail. The scream of the bombs, the feel of the stretcher in her raw hands, the smell of Peter Miller's burned flesh, the hollow finality of closing the eyes of the dead. She flinched when a staff car backfired outside. A part of her was still in that cellar, still listening for the next bomb, still waiting for the next crisis. The door opened, and the major from the rescue column entered, followed by a full-bird colonel, a man with a stern, weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. "Lieutenant Connelly," the major said gently, "this is Colonel Jenkins. He'd like to speak with you." Eleanor stood automatically, her posture ramrod straight from years of training. "At ease, Lieutenant," the colonel said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured for her to sit, taking the seat opposite her. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze not unkind, but intensely assessing. "Major Collins here has given me a preliminary report," the colonel began. "What you and your people accomplished last night, it's nothing short of miraculous. The initial estimates from the bombing were that the field hospital was a total loss, with no survivors. To learn that you not only survived, but managed to evacuate every single patient, it defies belief." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I need you to walk me through it, Lieutenant, from the beginning." And so she did. Her voice was a monotone at first, a clinical recitation of facts. But as she spoke, as she described the first concussive blast, the decision to move the men, the terrifying runs across the courtyard, the collapse of the tent, the desperate innovation of using blankets, the final, soul-crushing effort in the cellar, the emotion began to bleed through. Her voice cracked when she spoke of the men they lost. It hardened when she described the moment she decided they would all get out. She didn't paint herself as a hero. She was simply a narrator of events, a cog in a machine of survival that had, against all odds, kept turning. The colonel listened without interruption, his expression growing ever more grave, and, beneath the gravity, a flicker of something like awe. When she finished, the room was silent for a full minute. "You understand, Lieutenant," the colonel said finally, "that your actions will be recommended for the highest commendation, the Distinguished Service Cross at a minimum, perhaps even the Medal of Honor. This is the kind of valor we read about in history books." The words should have meant something. They were the pinnacle of military recognition. But to Eleanor, they felt abstract, hollow. A medal couldn't give back the lives lost. It couldn't erase the memories. It couldn't heal Peter Miller's burns. "With all due respect, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "the men, they're the ones who displayed valor. They endured it. I did my job." Colonel Jenkins nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. He had seen this before, the burden of command, the weight of survival. "The job you did, Lieutenant, was far beyond what anyone could have expected or demanded. You saved 45 lives. 45 American soldiers who will see their families again because of you. Remember that. Hold on to that." He stood up, signaling the end of the debriefing. "You're being granted a week's leave, effective immediately. Get some rest, Lieutenant. You've more than earned it." He and the major left the room, leaving Eleanor alone once more. A week's leave. The concept was so alien it was almost laughable. Rest? How could she rest when every time she closed her eyes, she was back in the hell she had just escaped? She stood and walked to the window. Life went on. The war went on. But she felt disconnected from it all, a ghost walking among the living. The recognition, the leave, it was all part of a script she was supposed to follow. But the person who had started that night was gone, replaced by someone harder, older, haunted. She had left the cellar, but the cellar had not left her. And as she stood there, a decorated hero in a clean uniform, she felt more lost and alone than she ever had in the midst of the bombing. Because now there was no immediate crisis to fight, no lives hanging in the balance. There was only the long, quiet, and terrifying battle with the echoes in her own mind. The journey to the rear area rest camp was a blur of green countryside and shattered towns glimpsed from the window of a rattling truck. The violence of the front lines gave way to a tentative, bruised peace the further back they went. The rest camp itself was situated near a quiet French village, a collection of tents and repurposed buildings surrounded by fields that were, miraculously, still green. It was supposed to be an oasis, a place for shattered nerves to be reknitted and for weary bodies to find solace. For Eleanor, it felt like a gilded cage. The silence was the hardest part. After the constant adrenaline-fueled noise of the front and the oppressive, suffering-filled quiet of the cellar, this new silence was profound and unsettling. It was a silence that allowed the memories to rush in, unbidden and loud. The first night, she was given a cot in a tent with other nurses. She lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the peaceful, rhythmic breathing of the women around her. They slept the untroubled sleep of those who had not yet had their world torn apart. When she finally did drift off, the nightmares came. She was back in the courtyard, but the stretcher she was carrying was impossibly heavy. She looked down and saw it was filled with the faces of the men who had died, their eyes accusing her. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering, the sheets damp with sweat. She spent her days walking. She walked through the village, past houses with flower boxes in the windows, past cafes where GIs laughed and drank wine, past a church whose bells still tolled the hours. The normalcy of it all felt like a personal insult. How could life just go on? How could these people smile and laugh when, just a few miles away, men were dying in the mud? She felt a wall between herself and everyone else. They saw her clean uniform, her lieutenant's bars, but they didn't see the blood that still felt like it was on her hands. They didn't hear the screams that were still ringing in her ears. She tried to write a letter home to her parents in Dayton, to tell them she was safe and had been recognized for her actions. But the words wouldn't come. How could she possibly describe any of it? How could she tell them about the smell of a field hospital under bombardment, or the sound a man makes when he knows he's dying? She crumpled the paper and threw it away. One afternoon, she found herself sitting by a small, placid river that ran behind the camp. She skipped stones across its surface, a mindless, childhood activity that did nothing to quiet the storm inside. She thought about Peter Miller. Had he made it to a proper hospital? Was he still alive? The not knowing was a special kind of torture. She had been their rock, their savior, and now she was completely cut off from them, adrift in a sea of her own thoughts. A chaplain found her there. He was a young captain with a kind face. "Mind if I join you, Lieutenant?" he asked. She shrugged. He sat beside her on the riverbank, not speaking for a long time, just watching the water flow. "They're talking about you, you know," he said finally. "The story is getting around. The nurse who wouldn't leave her men." Eleanor didn't respond. She threw another stone, watching it skip once, twice, then sink. "It's a heavy burden," the chaplain continued softly, "carrying all those lives, feeling responsible for the ones you couldn't save." That got her attention. She looked at him, her eyes hard. "How would you know?" "I listen," he said simply. "I've heard similar stories from soldiers, from pilots, from Marines. The details are different, but the feeling is the same. The guilt of the survivor. It's a real wound, Lieutenant. It just doesn't bleed where anyone can see it." His words struck a chord deep within her. He saw it. He understood the battle she was still fighting. "How do you make it stop?" she whispered, the first real crack in her emotional armor. "The memories, the sounds." The chaplain sighed. "You don't make it stop, not really. You learn to carry it. You learn to make peace with the choices you made in impossible circumstances. And you focus on the lives you did save. You gave 45 men a future, Eleanor. That's a light that no darkness can completely extinguish." He stood up, brushing the grass from his trousers. "The war isn't over for you just because you're away from the front. Be kind to yourself." He walked away, leaving her with his words. They were a small comfort, a single flickering candle in the vast darkness of her memory. She looked at the river, at the way the current kept moving, relentlessly, carrying everything forward. She couldn't go back. She could only go forward. But as she stood to return to her tent, a deep, unsettling dread began to coil in her stomach. Her week of leave was almost over. Soon, she would be expected to return to duty, to put on the uniform once more, to walk back into the world of field hospitals and wounded men and the ever-present threat of death. The thought filled her with a cold, paralyzing fear that was somehow worse than the fear she had felt in the bombing raid. How could she possibly do it all again? The orders came on a crisp morning, delivered by a fresh-faced runner. Lieutenant Connelly was to report to the 28th Field Hospital, newly established just 10 miles behind the shifting front lines. The war, it seemed, was not done with her. As she packed her meager belongings, her hands were steady, but a cold dread had taken root in her heart. The thought of walking into another tent, of smelling the familiar scents of antiseptic and blood, of hearing the moans of the wounded, made her feel physically ill. The courage that had seemed an unshakable part of her during the raid had vanished, leaving behind a hollow, trembling core. The truck ride to the 28th was a silent, grim journey. The landscape became more familiar, more war-torn, with the distant rumble of artillery serving as a grim welcome back. The 28th was a carbon copy of her old unit. Rows of canvas tents, the Red Cross insignia boldly displayed, a frantic hive of activity. It was like stepping back in time, into the moments before the world had ended. She reported to the chief nurse, a stern, capable-looking woman in her 40s named Captain Vance. Captain Vance looked up from her paperwork, her eyes appraising. "Lieutenant Connelly, I've heard of you. Your file is impressive." Her tone was neutral, professional. "You'll be taking over Triage Tent B. We're expecting casualties from the push near the Siegfried line. It's going to be a long day." And just like that, she was back in it. Triage Tent B was identical to the one she had lost. The same layout, the same smells, the same sounds. For a moment, she stood frozen in the entrance, a wave of vertigo washing over her. The memories assaulted her, so vivid she could almost feel the ground shaking. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "You can do this. You have to do this." The first wave of casualties arrived, a cacophony of groans and shouted orders. They were young, so young, their faces pale and smeared with dirt and blood. Eleanor's training took over, her body moving on muscle memory. She assessed wounds, directed orderlies, applied tourniquets, but her hands trembled. When a young private with a leg wound screamed as she cut away his trousers, she flinched, the sound echoing the scream of the burned private from that night. She felt a panic attack building, a tightness in her chest, a shortness of breath. She had to get out. She had to get air. She mumbled an excuse to the nurse next to her and stumbled out of the tent, leaning against its canvas wall, gasping. She was failing. The hero of the 12th Field Hospital was crumbling under the weight of a normal day's casualties. Captain Vance was there, having observed her retreat. She didn't look angry, just thoughtful. "It hits everyone differently, Lieutenant," she said quietly, handing Eleanor a canteen. "There's no shame in it." I can't go back in there," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with shame. "I thought I could, but I can't." "Look at me, Connelly," Captain Vance commanded. Eleanor forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze. "What you went through was hell. No one expects you to just shake that off. But those boys in there," she jerked her head towards the tent, "they need you. Not the legend, you. A competent, caring nurse. You don't have to be a hero today. You just have to be a nurse. One bandage at a time. One soldier at a time. Can you do that?" Her words were a lifeline, a permission to be less than perfect, to be human. Eleanor nodded slowly, the tightness in her chest easing slightly. She wasn't being asked to single-handedly save dozens under a bombing raid. She was being asked to do her job. She could do that. Maybe. She took another deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked back into the triage tent. The noise and the smell hit her again, but this time she didn't fight it. She let it wash over her. She went to the next cot, to a corporal with a shrapnel wound in his arm. She focused only on him, on cleaning the wound, on administering a local anesthetic, on stitching him up. She blocked out everything else. One bandage at a time, one soldier at a time. It was a mantra. It was a shield. And for the rest of that long, bloody day, she held on to it for dear life, fighting a new, invisible enemy on a very familiar battlefield, wondering if this was a battle she could ever truly win, or if it was one she was destined to fight for the rest of her life. The days bled into one another, a relentless cycle of convoys, triage, surgery, and exhaustion. Eleanor functioned, a capable and efficient nurse, but the light that had once been in her eyes was dimmed. She moved through her duties like an automaton, her smile a practiced, professional curve of the lips that never reached her eyes. She avoided getting to know the patients beyond their wounds, building an emotional wall as high and as thick as the one she had built in that cellar. It was the only way to survive. The story of her actions at the 12th Field Hospital had spread, becoming a minor legend among the medical corps. New nurses looked at her with awe, which only made her feel more like a fraud. They saw a hero. She saw a woman haunted by ghosts. One evening, as she was finishing her shift, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Sergeant Miller, his arm in a sling, a broad grin on his face. "Well, I'll be damned, Lieutenant Connelly!" A genuine smile, the first in weeks, touched Eleanor's lips. "Sergeant Miller, what are you doing here?" "Took a piece of shrapnel in the shoulder a few days ago. Nothing serious. They're shipping me back to a rehab unit in England for a few weeks." He looked around the bustling hospital. "Heard you were here. Had to come see ya." They found a quiet spot outside, away from the noise. "How are you, Lieutenant? Really?" Miller asked, his tone shifting to one of genuine concern. The question, coming from him, was different. He had been there. He knew. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure wavered. "It's hard, Sergeant. Every day is hard." Miller nodded. "I know. I have the dreams, too. Jimmy, he didn't make it. Took a mortar shell a week after we got out. Never even knew what hit him." The news was a physical blow. The young, terrified orderly who had found his courage in that hell, gone. Another ghost to join the others. "I'm so sorry," Eleanor whispered. "He was brave," Miller said firmly. "He died a brave kid because of you. You showed him what he was made of." He looked at her intently. "We all carry it, Lieutenant. Every one of us. But we carry it together. You don't have to carry it alone." His words, coupled with the news of Jimmy's death, broke through the last of her defenses. She felt a tear trace a path through the grime on her cheek, then another. She didn't try to stop them. She stood there, in the gathering twilight, and finally allowed herself to grieve. For Jimmy, for the men they lost in the cellar, for the private with the burned flesh, for the innocence she had lost forever. Miller stood silently beside her, a solid, understanding presence. After a few minutes, she wiped her eyes, feeling strangely lighter, as if a poison had been drained from a wound. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, her voice thick but clear, "for everything." "No, Lieutenant," he said, shaking his head. "Thank you." He was shipped out the next day, but his visit had been a turning point. She started to let the wall down, brick by brick. She began to talk to the other nurses, to share a cup of coffee, to laugh at a stupid joke. She started to learn the names of her patients, to ask about their homes, their families. It was painful because it made them real, and losing them would hurt more. But it also made her real again. She was no longer just going through the motions. She was living and caring in the midst of death. One afternoon, a letter found its way to her. It was from Peter Miller's mother. The handwriting was elegant, the paper fragile. "Dear Lieutenant Connelly," it began. "My son Peter told me about you. He said you were an angel in hell. He said you held his hand and told him he was going to be okay, and that you saved his life. The doctors say he has a long recovery ahead, but he will live. He will come home to us. There are no words to express the gratitude in a mother's heart. You have given us back our boy. May God bless you and keep you safe." Eleanor read the letter over and over, the words blurring through her tears. This was the light the chaplain had spoken of. This was the antidote to the darkness. It didn't erase the memories, but it gave them meaning. It balanced the scales, just a little. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket over her heart. The war was still hell. The fear was still there. But as she walked back into the triage tent, ready for the next wave of wounded, she carried with her a new strength, forged not in the fire of bombs, but in the simple, profound power of a mother's thanks and the enduring bonds of those who had survived the storm together. She was ready to be a nurse again. The end of the war in Europe found Eleanor not in a grand celebration, but in a quiet field, standing before a row of white crosses. The 28th Field Hospital had advanced deep into Germany, and now, in the sudden, shocking silence of peace, she had sought out this temporary graves registration point. She walked slowly down the lines, her eyes scanning the names. She found the two men from the cellar, the ones she had closed the eyes of. She knelt, placing a small wildflower she had picked on each grave. There were no tears now, only a deep, abiding sorrow and a profound respect. They had not made it, but they had not been forgotten. Their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of so many, was written in the quiet dignity of this field. She thought of the long journey from that night of terror to this moment of peace. The bombing raid had been a crucible that had shattered her, and, in the breaking, had remade her. She was no longer the naive girl from Ohio, nor was she the hollow, haunted ghost of the rest camp. She was a woman who had stared into the absolute worst of humanity and had found, within herself and others, the absolute best. The valor wasn't in the absence of fear, but in the action taken in spite of it. The heroism wasn't in a single, legendary act, but in the daily, grinding choice to care, to endure, to hope. She stood and looked out over the sea of crosses, a silent army of the lost. The cost had been unimaginable. But as she turned to leave, her hand went to the pocket over her heart, where Peter Miller's mother's letter was folded, worn soft from repeated reading. He was home. He was alive. And because of that, because of the 44 others who had walked out of that cellar, the cost, while terrible, was not in vain. She walked back to the jeep that would take her to the debarkation point, to a ship, to a country she hadn't seen in 3 years. She was going home. The war was over, but the memory of it, the lessons of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit would be her constant companions. She had gone to war as a nurse, and she was returning as a living testament to the power of one person to make a difference. A quiet legend who knew that the greatest battles are often fought not for glory, but for the man in the next cot, and that the most profound victories are measured not in territory taken, but in lives saved. The jeep pulled away, carrying her from the field of the dead towards a future she had helped to secure, a future bought with blood and bravery, a future that she, and the men she saved, were now destined to live.